side of Lomachenko. Really high-level stuff. Unbelievable stuff. Right in the center of the ring. And the
Vasyl Lomachenko is perhaps the greatest fighter of our generation. And one of his most impressive attributes is his ability to use unorthodox techniques to confuse and dominate his opponents. We've already looked at how Lomachenko targets his opponent's vision, covering the slot in their guard to keep them in the dark, and leaving his rear hand behind to trick his competitors into thinking he's still there. This time, we'll take a look at another of Lomachenko's unusual but highly effective techniques. Rather than retract his jab, Lomachenko will keep his arm extended to circle and parry, much like a fencer redirecting an opponent's blade. He can then take advantage of the openings he's just created. This technique essentially works as a multi-purpose defensive movement. By using this straight arm parry off of his jab, Lomachenko can set up a variety of attacks and guard manipulations. In this clip, Lomachenko jabs, but instead of retracting his punch, he keeps his arm straight and uses it to deflect his opponent's counter cross. In this way, Lomachenko can immediately negate his opponent's counters. If his competitor ducks inside, Lomachenko will again keep his arm extended in circle. But this time, he can either swipe his glove in front of his competitor's eyes to block their vision, or pull down one of their hands. Yet another variation is to frame off of their head or shoulders. Lomachenko uses the stiff-armed parry as an all-purpose technique when disengaging, allowing him to deal with nearly any incoming attacks and giving him valuable time to assess the situation and find openings or weaknesses. But Lomachenko will often perform the exact opposite technique as well. Rather than keep his arm straight to manipulate his opponent's guard, Lomachenko will keep his hand stuck to his competitor to close distance. To do this, he'll either pull his opponent's guard down, creating an opening, or bend his own arm as he moves inside, framing off of his opponent to offset their balance or pin their arm. Mixing these techniques together makes for one of the most confusing skill sets to deal with in boxing, and is one of the many reasons that Lomachenko always seems to be one step ahead of his opponents. And this is just a few examples of the incredible variety of skillful techniques Lomachenko can manage off of his jab alone. He can use it to deflect, pin, pull, block his opponent's vision, and of course, punch them in the face. If you're like me, you can't wait to see how far Lomachenko will go, or what new techniques from the Matrix Vasyl Lomachenko has in store for us. It's time once again for Brilliant Exchanges, a segment where we look at some beautiful knockouts and knockdowns from a legendary fighter, breaking down just how they did it. Today we're covering Vasyl High-Tech Lomachenko. Before we begin, it's important to remember that Lomachenko is incredibly fond of breaking down and overwhelming an opponent's defenses over time, and that strategy helped contribute to many of these stoppages. Alright, let's get to it. The first KO we'll take a look at is a great example of the Matrix's ability to manipulate his opponent's positioning. Roman Rocky Martinez entered the ring with a fantastic record and enjoying a height and reach advantage. But Lomachenko quickly used his timing, speed, and volume to even the odds. By the 5th round, Martinez was biting on every single movement that Vasyl made, meaning that Lomachenko could easily put Martinez out of position with feints that only vaguely resembled real punches. These slight, non-committal movements not only saved Lomachenko energy, but kept him perfectly balanced so that he could follow up with a real shot immediately upon spotting an opening. Lomachenko moved Martinez back by faking a high-low 1-2 combination. He next built on this setup, reversing the punch order to feint to Martinez's body, then following up with a real rear hook to the head. A few more fake jabs to muddy the waters even more, and Lomachenko landed the exact same sequence again. Martinez was now in full-on survival mode, and Lomachenko only needed to wave his arm around like a child playing Harry Potter to create a massive overreaction. Martinez ducked, weaved, and stepped out to escape what he must have thought was a hook to the head. Instead, he had placed his chin in the perfect position for Lomachenko's rear uppercut. Martinez's head snapped back, and Lomachenko finished with a beautifully timed lead hook. And that's the end of that chapter. Lomachenko's knockout of Anthony Krala was another great example of how he uses feints and throwaway punches to set up his knockouts. Once Lomachenko noticed that Krala was responding to every feint and punch by ducking, he used a throwaway shot to set up a committed, perfectly aimed lead hook. The takeaway is that it's much easier to time a full power shot when you already have a good idea where the target will be beforehand. The next sequence is from Lomachenko's bout with Gamalier Rodriguez, and this knockout has a really cool mix of concepts to look at. In the 9th, Lomachenko casually threw a non-committed 1-2 combination, but he actually never intended to land, only to move himself offline so he could angle in a strong hook to the body. A few punches later, Rodriguez fired back with the lead hook. And here we see an example of how meticulous Lomachenko is about his form. Vasyl's tight, well-structured hook easily reached his target before Rodriguez's wider hook. This is what people mean when they use the term beat to the punch. Finally, Lomachenko finished by shuffling forward into a hard lead straight. This concept is very reminiscent of Manny Pacquiao, who would often use long-range footwork to set up short-range punches, adding a lot more power to the blow than would usually be expected. This next knockout showcases a tactic I talked about in one of my very first videos on this channel, how Lomachenko loves to turn his punches into frames in order to block his opponent's vision. And Lomachenko definitely needed every tool in his toolbox against Jorge Linares, who in this very same fight became the first man to ever knock Lomachenko down. But Loma's reaction was not to ease off the gas. Instead, he stomped down on the accelerator. In the middle of an intense exchange, Lomachenko feinted a jab and then framed his forearm against Linares' guard. He did not remove this cover until his follow-up punch was already on its way. Linares knew something was coming, but not what. Probably expecting a straight, he tightened his guard. But this incorrect split-second reaction turned out to be a fatal mistake. Rather than prevent a straight, tightening his guard opened a path up for a fight-ending blow to the liver. And if you go just a few punches back, Lomachenko had used another frame to set up a sneaky uppercut. This is just such a common tactic for him, it's pretty much built into his style. Still, Linares deserves a lot of credit for putting on such an incredible performance. I definitely recommend everyone check this match out. It's really incredible and one of my favorites. It's hard to believe we're at the 6th fight and I still haven't mentioned Lomachenko's footwork, but these last two should fix that. It's fairly common knowledge that for a southpaw, stepping to the right is a great tool for aligning the left power hand. But in his bout against Miguel Mariaga, Lomachenko demonstrated how it's also a great tool for cutting off the ring. Lomachenko slipped a jab and shuffled deep outside to throw across. Mariaga tried to hook and pivot out. However, Lomachenko's lead foot blocked his escape, throwing Mariaga completely off balance. Caught in such a terrible position, all it took was a short, tight cross from Lomachenko to send him flying. Mariaga was on his feet in moments, but that didn't stop Lomachenko from piling on even more pressure. Near the end of the round, Mariaga was weaving and circling, desperately trying to regain center ring. But once again, Lomachenko's lead foot positioning allowed no escape. Mariaga actually tripped over his own feet trying to get out of the corner. The Matrix capitalized immediately to score yet another knockdown. And although Mariaga again beat the count, his corner had seen enough and threw in the towel. Our last highlight is unusual because it's against another southpaw, Jose Pedraza. But that didn't stop Lomachenko from using his incredible footwork to create sharp angles and score a knockdown. In the 11th, Lomachenko landed some tight, Duran-like uppercuts from close range, then faded back. Pedraza decided to pursue, but Lomachenko linear shifted. Having forced his opponent completely out of position, Lomachenko landed a hard left hook as Pedraza tried to turn to catch up. He then smothered his guard to switch back to southpaw. He stabbed in an uppercut that cracked the guard before following up from the side. Before he could counter, Lomachenko used 2 throwaway punches to frame and jam Pedraza's offense once again. Pedraza looked to muscle Lomachenko back, but High Tech disengaged, stepping back to orthodox to land an unexpected lead uppercut that twisted Pedraza's head back to look up at the ceiling. He then followed with a tearing rear hook to the body. Whether from that punch or the next 2, Pedraza had had enough and dropped to his knee. Dazed but not done, he survived the count and continued on aggressively with a strong lead hook. But another beautiful display of positioning, framing, and body work from Lomachenko did the trick again. Pedraza went down swinging. And to his credit, he beat the count again, then managed to survive the next and final round, finishing the fight on his feet. Vasyl Lomachenko is a unique blend of creative tactics and techniques, born from decades of honing both mental and physical skills and strung together into one well-crafted, cohesive style. It's from that combination of strategy, creativity, and discipline that we see some of the most brilliant exchanges. It's become a bit of a meme that Vasyl high-tech Lomachenko downloads information about his opponents during the first few rounds. But the thing is, it's absolutely true. So today, we're going to look at 3 fights where Lomachenko picked up on certain flaws in his competitor's boxing within the first few rounds, and then examine how he used those weaknesses against them. By the end of this video, it should be clear that all Lomachenko needs is for an opponent to make one mistake. He could then capitalize on that mistake to establish a few offensive tools, then build up from there until he's landing nearly at will. And maybe it'll make a bit more sense how so many skilled warriors have simply given up, quitting on their stools. So let's get to it. We'll start with Rodriguez. Early in the fight, Lomachenko picked up on how Rodriguez rhythmically adjusted his guard. He then timed his jabs to capitalize on the brief moments Rodriguez left himself open. Allow me a moment to explain. There are a number of valid reasons for boxers to rhythmically adjust their guard, such as placing their hands in different positions so they can punch from different angles. But maybe more importantly, a fluid guard gives opponents less chances to pick up on an opening and then target it over and over. After all, every type of guard will have a few openings, no matter what. In fact, Lomachenko uses the openings in his own guard to draw an opponent's punch so that he can counter. And Lee has some great videos on this drawing tactic on his channel. But this was obviously not the case with Rodriguez, who became more and more bewildered by Lomachenko's jab as the fight went on. Rodriguez preferred lowering and raising his lead arm as he stepped, but because he did this with such consistent rhythm, Lomachenko was able to time his jab to pierce through the brief opening Rodriguez presented. He found the perfect angle for this, coming up from underneath each time Rodriguez raised and widened his guard. In fact, of the 116 jabs I counted Loma landing cleanly throughout the fight, 91 of them landed as Rodriguez raised his lead arm. By the last few rounds, Lomachenko had the timing down so well, he was landing at will. Whether Lomachenko consciously picked up on the opening in his opponent's guard, or simply found his timing over the first few rounds, is irrelevant. What does matter is that once Lomachenko had established his jab, the primary weapon for setting up offense in boxing, he could build on it to ramp up the pressure, setting up long combinations with complex footwork. These included some of his best-known tricks, like his Matrix Shuffle and Matador feints. Lomachenko finished the fight in the 9th. So we've seen how Lomachenko can exploit a hole in his opponent's defenses. But now, let's look at how he can exploit a hole in his opponent's offense. In his fight against Martinez, Lomachenko first tried to counter his jab in a number of different ways, testing which worked best. Countering with a hook absolutely did not work, and Martinez was too good at following Lomachenko for him to time a counter by stepping or slipping outside. But what did work well was ducking and slipping inside. And while intercepting with a counter jab didn't work too well, returning a counter cross did. And just as in the last example, once Lomachenko found a way through, he did not stop exploiting it. By punishing Martinez each time he jabbed, he did what's known as taking away an opponent's punch. Martinez became so hesitant to jab that he started leading with his cross, which ironically gave Lomachenko some trouble at first. A cross can be harder to defend in an open stance because the southpaw orthodox dynamic leaves the open side more, well, open. But once again, after working through his options, Lomachenko found an answer, stepping inside while controlling Martinez's head and arm. With his jab taken away and none of his power punches landing, Martinez went down in the 5th. Alright, one last example. We've looked at how Lomachenko exploits an opponent's offense and defense. But now, let's look at how he deals with an opponent's counters. Unlike the last fight showcased, against Walters, Lomachenko seemed intent on moving to the outside. Perhaps this was because Walters carried his lead hand low at times. Regardless, Lomachenko's intentions were quickly stifled. Walters immediately countered Lomachenko's jab and outside movement with a lead body hook, targeting the opening that Lomachenko's jab had created. This was a great strategy that was probably thought up in preparation for the fight, but Lomachenko found a few ways around it almost immediately. The first was to simply set up the outside shuffle with a cross rather than a jab, ensuring that his lead arm was kept in place to guard his side. The second was to control Walters' lead arm as he jabbed his way in, stifling Walters' defense. And even though Walters attempted this same counter several more times, he was never successful again. Lomachenko would either block or control the path of the punch. On top of this, Lomachenko found an effective counter to Walters' jab. Walters tended to drop his hand slightly after throwing, so Lomachenko was able to corkscrew his lead over his shoulder. Once again, whether Lomachenko noticed these vulnerabilities or not doesn't matter. What matters is that he logged in his mind that these were working and continued to build on them until Walters went down. This is why Lomachenko's opponents give up on their stools. It's not the punishment so much as the feeling of hopelessness. These are professionals who have dedicated their lives to reaching the highest levels of boxing, and they have no idea how they keep getting hit. They quit not because they're unwilling to take more punishment, but because they see no way back. This is the skill of Vasyl Lomachenko.
Vasyl Lomachenko is quickly building a reputation as one of the greatest boxers in a generation, and with under 10 professional fights. Why is self-evident. The question is how. How does Lomachenko make everyone else look like they're standing still, while he looks like Neo in the Matrix? The answer is both genius and surprisingly simple. It's well known that Lomachenko uses his incredible footwork to find a dominant angle from which to attack. But the secret lies in how he does this. But to understand that, you have to first understand that this boxer fights like he's playing a game of chess. Every step is pre-planned, and he knows exactly what his opponent's reaction will be before he does. He misdirects his competitor's attention, eliminates their ability to retaliate, and makes sure that no matter what the opponent's next move is, it always ends in checkmate. And he does so using one of the least talked about skills in fighting. Lomachenko takes his opponent's most valuable tool. More than his footwork, more than his speed, and more than his power, a fighter needs his vision. Lose track of your adversary's position for 1 split second, and you'll pay. When it comes to vision, a defensive boxing guard is a bit like a medieval knight's helmet. There are only small slots to see through, usually 1 in the front and 2 on either side. If you can cover these slots, the fighter's left in the dark. Lomachenko uses his competitor's own defense against them. He coaxes his opponents to cover up tightly, blocks their remaining vision, moves off angle, and then throws. Let's look at an example of how he sets up one of his most impressive sequences, one I like to call the Matador. First, his jab causes his competitor to shell up. Then he feints with his backhand, but unlike an ordinary feint, he keeps his hand in place as he moves to the outside, blocking the front eye slot. He makes sure to keep his hand in their line of sight as he moves away. If all they can see through the small gap in their guard is his hand, they assume the rest of him is still there too. This means that Lomachenko is using his glove the same way a matador uses his cape against a charging bull. The fact this trick works is nothing short of astonishing. As I said before, brilliant and amazingly simple. I can't imagine how frustrating this must be for his opponents, not to mention painful. Lomachenko also likes to block the vision slots on the side of the guard, using his glove, forearm, or shoulder. This traps his adversary's arms in place, protecting him from counters. He can also control their head or pull down their guard. He doesn't need his opponent to cover up to block their vision. He can simply cross one hand over his competitor's eye and then attack with his other hand. As his opponent's eyes get more and more swollen, vision control becomes easier and easier. But one question remains. How does Lomachenko look like he's defying the laws of physics when he pivots and shuffles to his opponent's side? Well, part of the answer to that is that he's just really, really good. But another is that he leans his weight on his opponent's back while shuffling. This keeps his competitors immobile, and I suspect it has a lot to do with his footwork looking like he's breaking the rules of the Matrix. For all of his physical abilities, Lomachenko's most important attribute is his mind. He follows the first tenet from Sun Tzu's The Art of War. If you know the enemy, and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Lomachenko has some of the best footwork ever seen in the ring, and his most unique sequence is what I like to call his Matrix Shuffle. The Matrix Shuffle is actually a combination of a pivot and a shuffle. As you swing your back foot around a pivot, you're also going to bring it towards your front foot. The momentum will get you airborne and swing you around to the other side of your opponent. Today we're going to break down the move with step-by-step drills that you can do on the bag or with a partner. I covered Lomachenko's footwork and feints in a prior breakdown video, so you might want to check that out after you're done with this one. Let's begin by looking at the setup. The first thing Lomachenko does is to step in with the jab or a feint. This lets him sneak his back foot up to a narrow stance in preparation. This will feel weird if you're not used to it, but it's pretty easy to get down. Next he steps far to the outside, usually blocking his opponent's vision by feinting across. The motion should almost feel like giving the mitts a high five. The next part is deceptively difficult, so let's build it step by step. First, perform the setup, and then shuffle past your partner. Next, add a turn to the shuffle, so you end up facing your partner. And now try it with a pivot. Once you're comfortable, try combining these motions together, and you basically have it. Now let's look at a few tips to make it go smoother. You want to step your foot out at an outside angle, landing on your heel first. This gives you plenty of room to pivot off your lead foot as you swing your back foot around. You should begin moving your back foot to your front almost as soon as you start your pivot. The momentum should carry both of your feet off the ground, and both your knees should be bent. Spread your feet out wide before you land for a stable base. Practice punching after you land, and you have the Matrix Shuffle down. Once you're comfortable, you could try adding on some trickier moves, like pulling down your opponent's guard, or leaning on them if they duck under your jab. You can also try an angle shift by jumping off of both feet, which was one of Tyson's favorite moves. The fight between Vasyl Lomachenko and Guillermo Rigondeaux was shocking. Lomachenko dismantled an undefeated champion widely considered one of the greatest of all time, making him quit on his stool. While the ending was disappointing, there were a lot of very high-level techniques that Lomachenko employed incredibly well throughout the fight. So let's take a look at how Lomachenko absolutely destroyed one of the greatest defenses in boxing.
and then quickly examine why Rigondeaux decided to say, "No mas." Rigondeaux's style is built around keeping his opponents at arm's length and maintaining a slow, steady tempo so that he can force his opponents to overreach and then counter them. In order for Lomachenko to take control of the fight, he needed to dictate the distance and pace. And Lomachenko pulled this off the very first round. He began by disrupting Rigondeaux's footwork. Every time Rigondeaux got settled in place to set up an exchange, Lomachenko immediately circled away and changed angles. Notice how Lomachenko moves away every time Rigondeaux sinks down onto his lead leg. By taking away his ability to ground himself, Lomachenko took away Rigondeaux's power and balance. Once Lomachenko had disrupted Rigondeaux's footwork, he began dismantling one of his best tools, his lead right hand. Rigondeaux keeps a closed, narrow stance with few openings, and uses his lead arm like a shield, blocking punches with his forearm or elbow. He uses tactile senses to gauge the intentions of his opponents and set up his counters. But Lomachenko took away Rigondeaux's attempt at lead hand control using his own lead hand. He would feint high and low and circle and deflect Rigondeaux's arm like a fencer. He would throw multiple jabs before changing position to repeat the process again. Lomachenko was now effectively able to get close to Rigondeaux and fight at his preferred range. It had taken him less than a round to accomplish what no other boxer had before. And woven through all of these techniques was Lomachenko's use of broken rhythm. Once Lomachenko had taken away Rigondeaux's footwork and lead hand control, he neutralized Rigondeaux's second line of defense, his upper body movement. Like Mayweather, Rigondeaux likes to lean back, duck, and pivot to change the angle. The technique is a great way to stay in the center of the ring and avoid getting caught on the ropes. But his over-reliance on this defensive maneuver turned into a major problem for Rigondeaux. Lomachenko's footwork allows him to easily follow a pivoting opponent, and he took advantage of Rigondeaux's low crouch by framing off of his shoulders. Lomachenko is an expert at manipulating his opponent's guard at close range. His goal is to destroy his opponent's balance, vision, and ability to counter. He'll pin his opponent's arms in place, pull down their guard to create new openings, use his glove or forearm to keep them in the dark, and frame against their neck to destroy their balance and power. Notice how Lomachenko moves in and immediately pins both of Rigondeaux's arms and leans his weight on him. When Rigondeaux tried to lean back instead of crouch and pivot, Lomachenko simply tracked his head movement with jabs. Rigondeaux did get off one good attempt at a powerful left hook that Lomachenko narrowly ducked at the end of the round. But Lomachenko wouldn't let himself get into this position again for the duration of the fight. Once again, Lomachenko managed all of this during the first round of the fight, and it would continue the same way for the rest of the match, with Lomachenko getting more and more comfortable ramping up the pace, and Rigondeaux's only adjustment made being to clinch almost every exchange. In the end, Rigondeaux said he was unable to continue. It's understandable that Rigondeaux quit, but it's strange he quit with so few adjustments, repeating the same defunct techniques that had gotten him punished before for several more rounds, and throwing very few shots himself. There are a lot of questions that haven't yet been answered, and may never be. It remains a mystery how badly Rigondeaux's hand was hurt, with some questioning if it was hurt at all. Looking back through the footage, it's hard to find anything that could have damaged it heavily. It's also an odd precedent to quit over a hand injury in a championship fight. While the health of a fighter should always be of utmost importance, there are certain moments that are so critical to the sport and to the fighter's legacy that many have weathered through, and even gone on to victory, with Lomachenko himself being one of these fighters. While it's sad that such a great boxer has most likely had his career come to an end in this manner, it's truly inspiring to see Lomachenko continue to grow and improve. I'm really looking to see his upcoming fights and what the future has in store for him. That about does it for this one. You can let everyone know your own thoughts on Lomachenko in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out my book and companion videos, Power of the Pros, linked below. For the Modern Martial Artist, this has been David Christian, wishing you happy training.